Who's next?
Dr. Davis.
Dr. Davis. Good afternoon, Dr. Davis. Raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Have a seat. Stay here, witness.
Thank you. Once you get situated, Dr. Davis, if you would, for the record, state your full name, please.
Roger Todd Davis, D-A-V-I-S.
And what's your occupation?
I'm a clinical psychologist. I specialize in forensic psychology.
How long have you been so licensed?
Since 1995.
That's here in the state of Florida?
Yes.
Okay. I know the court's aware of your background. You guys stipulate as to.
We'll stipulate Dr. Davis is qualified to render opinion.
The court is familiar with Dr. Davis and his qualifications. He will be permitted to offer opinion testimony.
Thank you, Your Honor. You just heard Dr. Kropp testify. You have the benefit of his deposition. And so, obviously, I think we're going to be able to skip past a lot of the historical stuff here. But I'm going to ask you, you heard all of the records Dr. Kropp reviewed, jail, history, law enforcement records, all of that. Have you reviewed that same set of records?
Yes.
Okay. And did you evaluate Spencer Pearson in this case?
Yes.
And can you tell the court how many times and kind of the time and how that broke up?
Sure. I went to the jail the first time.
Dr. Davis, could you do me a favor, just adjust the microphone?
Sure.
Thank you.
I went to the jail the first time, September 13th of this year. Met with him for about 2.5 hours. And then saw him a second time at the jail for almost 2 hours, an hour and 53 minutes. And then most recently, I saw him at the jail October 3rd of this year for about 35 minutes.
Okay, all right. And did you interview any other people in Mr. Pearson's life to get that historical background?
I interviewed his parents also on October the 3rd for 54 minutes.
Okay. All right. I'm going to cut right to it, Dr. Davis. The diagnoses that Dr. Kropp discussed of Spencer Pearson of major depressive disorder. I know you agree with that general diagnosis, but how do you disagree, if you do, from Dr. Kropp on some of the qualifiers?
Well, Dr. Kropp testified that he diagnosed Mr. Pearson with major depressive disorder with psychotic features. I disagree with the specifier of psychotic features. I don't believe that Mr. Pearson has suffered from psychosis.
And how so do you disagree?
I'm going to refer to my report.
Yes, sir.
Let's see. Well, Mr. Pearson had received treatment before he came to jail at Baptist and also at Shands and had not been diagnosed with psychosis there. Also, since he's been at the detention center for approximately the last year and a half, he's not been diagnosed with psychosis there. Now, he did report hearing hallucinations to some of the mental health providers, especially when he was first there. However, there's a nurse practitioner who saw him a total of 13 times. He's the individual who prescribes meds, and he did not report experiencing psychotic symptoms to the nurse practitioner. He did not exhibit any behavioral signs of psychosis when I met with him. I talked to him for approximately 5 hours, and there were no behavioral signs of psychosis. A third factor was that his description of the psychotic features, most notably auditory hallucinations, included some features which were inconsistent with research investigating psychosis. For example, he said that sometimes the voices would initiate conversations. That's atypical. Voices come to you. You don't start the conversation. He said that voices could last continuously, have a conversation with him for something like 25, 30 minutes. Auditory hallucinations are much briefer, maybe a minute or two at most. So there were some inconsistent descriptions of the symptoms as well. He didn't express delusions. A delusion is another psychotic symptom. It's a fixed false belief that's clearly inconsistent with reality. And the reason that's important in terms of whether someone's feigning is that typically the research shows us is that when someone experiences hallucinations, they also have delusions. I gave him a screening test. It's called the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms Test. The acronym is the MFAST. And his score on that screening test was suggestive of feigning symptoms. Another factor was that he told me that he had been experiencing hallucinations since middle school, and yet when he was subsequently evaluated at Baptist and also by the nurse practitioner at the jail, he denied experiencing hallucinations, so that's inconsistent. I gave him, or he completed a more comprehensive test, the Personality Assessment Inventory, the PAI. That test was, he responded honestly to that test, and the results were not indicative of psychosis. And another factor I considered is that Dr. Kropp gave him that same test, the PAI, as well as 2 versions of the MMPI, which is similar to the PAI. And on each case, he feigned psychological symptoms. He did so to the extent that the results were invalid.
But yet when you sometime later gave him the PAI, your results were accurate as far as no signs of feigning symptoms.
There were no signs of feigning symptoms, and just as importantly, no signs of psychosis.
Right, so then you're allowed to move on. Okay,
right,
no
you can
feigning.
Interpret the results.
Right. You can actually interpret them.
Yes.
And that gave you an indication of no psychosis.
Yes.
And so that's kind of why you don't add that qualifier to the depression.
Right. I haven't seen any evidence of it in the records, aside from Dr. Kropp's diagnosis and aside from his statement to a couple of the mental health folks at the jail that he'd been hallucinating. But again, that was inconsistent.
Right. You do agree as to social anxiety disorder?
I do.
I believe Dr. Kropp's withdrawn bipolar, but you did not agree with that at the time you read his report.
That's correct.
Okay. And so now turning to the diagnosis of autism, do you agree or not, and why? Just let the court know.
I don't believe he has autism spectrum disorder. I do feel he has social anxiety disorder, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. They both involve behaving in an awkward manner, feeling uncomfortable in social situations. In fact, a lot of people with autism spectrum disorder, maybe 25 to 50%, also have social anxiety. The converse is not necessarily true. A lot of people, generally people with social anxiety, don't also have autism spectrum disorder. It's because autism spectrum disorder has additional symptoms that are not included in social anxiety disorder, like unusual behaviors or nonverbal communications that are not seen in people with social anxiety disorder. Another reason that I don't believe that he had social anxiety disorder was that there's some problems with the autism rating scale, the Gilliam Autism Rating Scale, 3rd edition, and the acronym's the GARS-3. Now, in some sense, it's a good screening test, but the fact that it's a screening test is important. When you give someone a screening test, it has relatively few items, and what you're trying to do is, in a timely manner, to save some time, give a relatively quick test that is going to be good at identifying people with a particular problem, like autism spectrum. But the problem with screening tests is that they cast such a wide net that oftentimes sort of include a lot of people that are diagnosed with autism based on a test that don't have it. And in fact, that's the case with this test. There's a study, it's from 2022. The name of the study is The Diagnostic Utility of the Gilliam Autism Rating Scale, 3rd edition, Parent Report in Clinically Referred Children. And they say children, but it goes up to age like 22 or 23. So it includes adults as well. And what's really important from this study is that they found that there were 99 people that they had in the study who did not have autism. They determined that by doing other evaluation.
That had originally been screened as having autism.
No, that did not have autism.
Okay.
So there 99 people in this study were assessed prior to giving the GARS not to have autism. But yet when they were given the GARS, 82 of them scored as positive for autism. So extremely high, what we call a false positive rate. or you're incorrectly diagnosing someone with a disorder that they don't have.
And that's why you, in your profession, go to the DSM-5, right? And look at all the actual criteria.
Well, absolutely, yeah.
And you don't find
right.
that Mr. Pearson meets that.
As you were stating earlier, autism is broken up into autism spectrum disorder is broken up in two categories, one of which is persistent deficits in social communication, social interaction. Now, in order to have that prong, that factor, you need, there are three criteria. You must have all of them, okay? One of the criteria is deficits in social emotional reciprocity, like difficulty having conversations, difficulty interacting. I don't question that Mr. Pearson has that. Again, I think that accounts for the social anxiety. Another factor or prong is deficits in developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. I don't question that he has that. What I do question is the third factor that you must have, and this is deficits in nonverbal communicative behaviors used for social interaction, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and nonverbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, deficits in understanding use of gestures, total lack of facial expression, nonverbal communication. That's a lot. But I observed him for 5 hours. I didn't see any evidence of that. I mean, the only thing possible is that when I initially met with him, he averted eye contact. But he became relatively comfortable pretty quick, and that wasn't an issue after that. And I asked his parents about these behaviors, and they said they didn't see evidence of it either. So you must have that criteria to have autism spectrum disorder. Since I don't believe he has that criterion, I don't believe he meets the criteria for that diagnosis. In addition, the other factors that I considered was the issues that I have with the GARS 3.
Right. Okay. And let me ask you this, Dr. Davis. You heard Dr. Kropp just testify, and he gave an opinion that Mr. Pearson is not, I believe he said he is not at risk for future violence.
Right.
Do you have a response, commentary on that?
I do. What we're trying to do is use a risk assessment tools. We don't just simply say, I believe this because I'm a doctor, it's so. We use risk assessment tools. The most common that we use is called the HCR20, where it's a questionnaire where you have 20 different areas that you assess for future violence. And one of the factors is whether or not someone's been violent in the past. So certainly that's a red flag, an impossible concern for future violence. The other thing is that when we, let's say I was to use the HCR20, when I would write my report, we're taught not to give categorical statements like this person's not going to be violent, this person is going to be violent. It's much more contextual. In certain situations where this individual is facing a lot of stress and he's perhaps using drugs and he's perhaps in a stressful relationship and he's unemployed, and you can go on and on and on, those would be a situation where this individual might be high risk. And other situations, maybe where he has a stable job, a good relationship, and other things, he might be a lower risk. That's what we're taught to do. It very much depends upon the context that the person's in.
So that blanket statement Dr. Kropp said is number one, not what you're supposed to do as a clinician, correct?
It's not what I was trained to do, no.
Okay, all right. And neither Dr. Kropp nor you did risk assessment.
That's correct.
Correct. I don't have any further questions for you, Dr. Davis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cross-examination.
Good afternoon, Dr. Davis.
Good afternoon, District Surgeon.
I was doing some rudimentary math upon direct examination, and you have 2.5 hours initially with Mr. Pearson, another 2 hours with Mr. Pearson, another 35 minutes with Mr. Pearson.
4.5 hours.
4.5 hours.
Yes, thank you.
And another hour with his parents.
That's correct.
Okay. And you had mentioned on direct that the nurse practitioner at the jail, who had encountered him 13 times, didn't report any symptoms of psychosis.
That's correct.
Do you know the extent of that encounter with the nurse practitioner and Mr. Pearson?
No, I don't.
Are you familiar with how they do checks in the St. Johns County Jail, mental health staff, that is?
I don't have a lot of familiarity. No.
So he or she could be passing by the cell personally?
No, I do know the provider, and I don't believe the provider. I think he's a pretty competent, thorough provider, so I don't think he does a drive-by and he just sort of asks 2 questions and that sort of satisfies. There's a checklist that they, of numerous, 10s, 20, 30 items that he has to assess. So I don't think it's a 2-minute interview, but I can't say how thorough it is.
And in the records you were provided, including the St. Johns County Jail,
Right.
that had no such checklist for these encounters, did it?
He did. He lists
In the
things like
records?
thought process, thought content, suicidal ideation. Yes, in his notes that were there.
There were notes, but you didn't see any checklist.
Well, that's what I'm referring to as like a checklist. There would be a content area like thought content, and the nurse practitioner would write normal. Thought content could be, reason that's relevant, it could be a delusional statement. So what the nurse practitioner is indicating is that Mr. Pearson was not voicing delusions.
But you have no idea the length or the depth of that encounter, do you?
That's correct.
Regarding the autism, you were present for Dr. Kropp's testimony.
Yes.
And he conceded on examination that he doesn't believe autism played much of a role in the offense conduct here. So, correct?
Yes.
So whether he has autism or not is not necessarily germane to the decision the court has to make.
I'm not certain I can say that. I mean, that's for the judge to decide how important it is.
But you took issue, and there was a critique of the GARS test, right?
Yes.
And that was a screening tool that in the critique you were citing, was over-inclusive.
Yes, it falsely identified people as having autism when they didn't have it.
Likewise, the MFAST, which I understand you administered
Right.
to determine feigning,
Right.
that's another screening test, correct?
There's the score that Mr. Pearson earned, there's a 14% error rate for that, 14% probability that, in fact, that he wasn't feigning.
And you didn't find him to be feigning?
I did find him to be feigning.
In your examination?
Yes.
In the personality assessment inventory?
No, I'm sorry, the MFAST. The screening test is the MFAST. The personality assessment inventory is a more comprehensive test. He was honest on that.
Okay, but the MFAST is just another rather quick screening.
It is a quick screening, yes.
Regarding the autism, once again for a second.
Yes.
Initially, when your deposition was taken,
Yes.
one of the bases for your believing that or disagreeing with a diagnosis of autism was that the GARS, or that screening test we were just talking about, that was administered to Pearson's family members, was right at the cutoff. You remember testifying to that?
I misscored it. You're absolutely correct. And I sent you an email along with Ms. Dutton notifying you of that. But what I didn't include, and I think is relevant, is that they standardized this screening test with just individuals with autism spectrum disorder, like 1,800 people. So it's very thorough. But when you compare Mr. Pearson's score, even if you say it's accurate, he was only at the 10th percentile, meaning 90% of the people that they developed this test with had higher scores on this test than him.
But when you had candidly admitted you
Yes.
scored it by about 10 points, correct?
Yes, I scored the raw score rather than a standard score where you do a statistical analysis, yes.
Nevertheless, you still maintain you don't believe he's
Well,
suffering from autism.
for the reasons that I testified to, yes.
Now, we had the discussion of psychosis, and you were present for Dr. Kropp's testimony, and he's not testifying that he believes he was acting in a psychotic state at the time of the offense, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And indeed, he never diagnosed him with psychosis or a psychosis diagnosis. It was related to the major depressive with psychotic features, correct?
Yeah, that's sort of parsing words. I mean, major depression with psychotic features is a psychotic disorder.
But there's a separate disorder in the DSM of psychosis.
Well, there's a lot of psychotic disorders in the DSM. There's schizophrenia, there's schizoaffective disorder, there's unspecified schizophrenia spectrum, and other psychotic disorder. There's several disorders that involve psychosis.
And
yes,
there's been no diagnosis of that from anyone,
that's correct.
including Dr. Kroc.
Right.
And regarding the potential for future violence, apart from the offense conduct, are you aware of any violent behavior of Mr. Pearson outside of the offense conduct?
No, I'm not.
Okay. And that bodes well. That's a mitigating circumstance, is it not?
It's certainly something in his favor, yes.
And you would agree with me, would you not, that Mr. Pearson would benefit from therapy?
Yes.
He would benefit from continued medication?
Yes.
And that he's amenable to such treatment after spending 4.5 hours with him?
I believe so.
Give me 1 moment. I have nothing further.
Redirect.
No, Your Honor.
Dr. Davis excused.
You may.
Thank you, Dr. Davis.
Thank you.
Have a great day. City Attorney's Assistant, please.